History is often dictated by the right man at the right place and at the right time. Today in 2016, we're sadly no longer surprised by terrorist attacks or the way the terrorist cases are handled, but it wasn't always that way. Even though it was a long time ago, I think we can all very well remember the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. Nobody knew what really to do. Was this a one-time deal? Is there a problem? Will it happen again? But fortunately, we had the right man at the right place at the right time. Andrew McCarthy was minding his own business as the federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. And from scratch, he put together the case against the 10 terrorists. And it was through those investigations that they were able to stop the planned simultaneous attacks of the Holland Tunnel, the Lincoln Tunnel, and the FBI headquarters. In October of 1995, all 10 terrorists were convicted, including the life imprisonment of the blind Sheikh. And that case was so strong that after the case was brought on appeal, the Second Circuit unanimously upheld the convictions of each and every terrorist. Yes, again, the right man at the right place at the right time. And there was a lasting effect. It wasn't just back in 1993. Mr. McCarthy was primary responsibility for the transition from finding these cases from a law enforcement-centric track to a war footing track. Again, the right man, the right place, at the right time. And tonight, that man is here at the Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Andrew McCarthy.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I'm doing that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. It's a thrill to be here. Erica, thank you so much for the kind words. And it's especially a thrill to be here on the anniversary of the 19th Amendment. I had no idea. As far as I'm concerned, women might as well have the right to vote because it's been made clear to me in my house that they have the right to rule. So why not? And I was glad to be able to start out with that because I thought it might be a little edgy to start with a Second Amendment joke tonight. So we'll just leave that on the side. But the topic I wanted to discuss this evening was the new terrorist threat. Except I'm not able to discuss the new terrorist threat since it's the same terrorist threat that we've been dealing with really now for about a quarter century. And I think a large part of the reason why it's the same terrorist threat is because we're even less willing today to confront it, to understand it, to see it for what it is, than we were back in 1993, when at least we had the excuse that we didn't have a track record of terrorism to inform us about what we were up against. Erica mentioned that nobody seemed to quite know what to make of this threat when the World Trade Center was bombed on February 26th, 1993. That's certainly true in my case. We had no prior experience with international terrorism to speak of. We had had some episodes of it from time to time, but certainly not a template for how you deal with it, a template for how you prosecute it, or even the question that we didn't get around to till much later was whether you should be prosecuting it at all as a criminal justice matter as opposed to a law of war matter, a national security challenge. It happened that after the bombing, they turned to me to run the investigation, not because I was any kind of a rocket scientist. It was because I had had some experience prosecuting international drug cartels and international Cosa Nostra, mafia families. And because we didn't have a model for how you do counterterrorism cases in the international way, global terrorism, I simply had the experience that seemed to match or be the closest analog that we had to what it was that we were dealing with. But it didn't take very long getting into it to understand that it was different in almost every way from any kind of traditional crime, whether it's domestic crime or international crime. My own experience with it, I think, is worth retelling because it's the same experience a lot of us go through. And I should preface this by saying that the first Muslims who I met in our investigation were not terrorists. Quite to the contrary, the first Muslims I met were an informant who was working for the FBI who actually helped us infiltrate the blind Sheikh's cell, and without whom we could not have stopped those simultaneous bombings. As Erica said, the Lincoln and Holland tunnels, the FBI's downtown Manhattan headquarters, and there was one other target which is interesting and worth putting on the table. The other target was the UN's headquarters on the east side of Manhattan. I always think that's worth pointing out, just because a lot of people in the government continue to think that we can negotiate with terrorists because ultimately when you scrape away all the militancy, they can be rational actors. And I like to counter that, well, the reason they wanted to bomb the United Nations was because, as we all know, it's a mighty instrument of American power in the world. At least that was their theory for it. So I don't think they're quite as rational as some people do. But you know, I don't think I was very rational either, because we were saying as a government in 1993 pretty much exactly the same thing that we're saying today. And it was something I wanted to believe. I was somebody who had about as much knowledge of Islam as anyone with a reasonably good education in the United States, which is to say, not a lot. And I wanted to believe what we were saying as a government, and that is that the couple of dozen or so people who were implicated, at least at the beginning that we thought were implicated, were basically a bunch of knuckleheads in Jersey City and a little corner of Brooklyn, and that if we could just neutralize them, all would be well. They were not representative of any religion. They certainly were not representative of any strain of Islam. And we said that again and again and again. And even though we're supposed to be hard-nosed prosecutors who wanted, evidence for everything, we said that again and again and again, notwithstanding that we didn't know the first thing we were talking about Islam. I mean, if you think about it, what you were being asked to believe, what I was believing, what the country was believing, is that, Bill Clinton and Janet Reno knew more about Islam than the blind Sheikh did. Which, if somebody had made that claim to me in another context, in a different kind of case, I would have said it was absurd. Here, we couldn't believe it fast enough. We believed what we wanted to believe. Now, anyone who's a little bit familiar with my writings over the years knows that I have said just about every bad thing that you can say about treating terrorism, international terrorism, as a criminal justice problem, and why the system doesn't mesh well with the threat. And we can get into that. Let me tell you what the one really, really good thing about using the criminal justice system turned out to be. Every place in our government, just like today, and every place in the media, and on the campuses and wherever you looked, people were going out of their way after the World Trade Center was bombed to mount a defense of Islam, even though people were kind of also going out of their way not to attack Islam. And they were very single-minded in the idea of absolving Islam of any involvement in the bombings that had happened, the threats that we knew that we were under, the continuing threat we believed we were under as we got to understand our evidence better. The one place on planet Earth where that wasn't true was the four corners of our courtroom. And the reason it wasn't true, and I think this is a real crucible of truth in a way, it's something to be very proud of about the American justice system. And that is that if you are going to ask jurors to convict people for serious crimes that send them to jail for a very long time, they want to know not only what happened, they want to know why it happened. And if you can't give them a rational explanation for what happened, they will not convict people. They will not find that you've proved your case. In every criminal case, we have to prove intent. And when you're dealing with the case that we brought, we actually had to prove that they had a specific intent to make war on the United States, and that they had a motive to do that. So regardless of what they were saying about Islam and its relationship to violence and militancy, whether it was in the White House or in the main justice down in Washington, or even in the steps of the courthouse, inside the courtroom, we got to prove what happened and why it happened. No political correctness, no purging information, no workplace violence, none of that. We actually got to tell people what happened. And having the burden to tell them what happened made the nature of my job in those days probably different, not just me, but the handful of other people who were working on this endeavor, a different vantage point than most people, I'd say almost anyone in America had. Because even though I wanted to believe what we were saying as a government, I had the obligation to establish for the jury why the things that these guys were accused of had happened. Now, our defendant, the blind Sheikh, is a guy named Omar Abdel Rahman. And he was portrayed to the country as a crazy person, as a wanton mass murderer who was killing evidently for no reason. And almost nobody in the country knew that Omar Abdel Rahman was a doctor of Islamic jurisprudence, graduated from Al-Azhar University, which is the seat of Sunni Islamic learning since the 10th century. He was one of the renowned scholars in the world on Islam, and in particular, Islamic law and jurisprudence, Sharia, and the jurisprudence of Sharia, which is known as fiqh. Now, think about the blind Sheikh for a second, because I think this makes a point when it dawned on me, it was like being hit by a thunderbolt, but it didn't occur to me for a long time. And I'm slow at times, but I don't think I'm that slow. But the blind Sheikh was utterly incapable of doing anything that would be helpful to a terrorist organization. Think about that. He was not only blind, he had about every other malady known to man. He had bad ticker, diabetes, a series of pretty significant health problems that rendered him useless in a business that is about doing brutal violence, right? So couldn't build a bomb, couldn't do a hijacking, couldn't carry out an assassination. The only thing he could do in a terrorist organization was lead it. Now, why was that? What's the reason for that? The reason for it was because he was a renowned, understood, authoritative master of the doctrine that is the background of the threat that confronts America. That was the sole and only reason that he had authority. It was the sole and only reason that he was able to lead in an enterprise that, frankly, he didn't have any hands-on experience carrying out. But he did and was a master of the ideology. And what we should have known from the start, based on that graphic example, is that in this threat, ideology is everything. And it continues after a quarter century to be the thing that we don't want to know anything about, to be the thing that we hide our head in the sand over. The other thing that was interesting for me personally about the blind sheikh was, in a criminal case, defendant never has to testify. But the defendant has a right to testify. And they don't have to tell you whether they're testifying or not until the end of the trial. And this was a particularly long trial. It actually took about 9 months to complete in 1995. So we went a long time not knowing whether he would testify. And as a result, we had to get ready for him to testify. So we went to school on him. I knew if I had to cross-examine him, I would have a chance to test what we were saying as a government. Now, I was raised as an Irish Catholic in the Bronx, right? And he's a doctor of Islamic jurisprudence from the greatest Islamic university in Cairo. So I was not dopey enough to think that I was going to be able to get into a theological debate with him. But I did think that if what we were saying as a government was true, if it was true that he was lying about Islam, that there had to be 2 or 3 places where I could nail him, where I could say, you said this, and the doctrine says that. So we went to school on him, and he was a very prolific writer. He was a very prolific speaker. We had a pile this high of transcripts of speeches he had given, conversations recorded that he had had, many of them recorded by him on purpose, because this was a big recruiting tool to have the blind sheikh's recordings played in your mosque, books that he had written, etc. And what did we find out to our consternation? We found out that when he cited Islamic doctrine, when he talked about the Quran, when he talked about the Hadith, which are the words and deeds of the Prophet, when he talked about authoritative biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, which are sacralized in Islam, when he cited a proposition of doctrine, he cited it accurately. When he said, the Quran commands us to terrorize the enemies of Allah, you could open up the Quran and find the verse that said, you are commanded to terrorize the enemies of Allah. When he rendered a story from the Hadith, you could look it up. He was accurate about it. Now, you could argue, as time went by, I actually thought less of this argument, but you could argue that the doctrine says a lot of other things that he should have included for purposes of completeness, and that, you know, if you took these things that he said and put them in their proper context, they would not sound as belligerent as they actually sounded. That again is an argument that if you looked at it carefully was not very persuasive. But put that aside. The one thing you couldn't say is that he was lying. You couldn't say that he had hijacked Islam, that he was lying about what it said. It actually said what he said it said. Now, again, I should clarify that my own view of it, for what it's worth, is that there is no single Islam, and that there are a variety of interpretations of Islam globally, such that I think one of the most critical mistakes that we've made as a country is to make part of our national security strategy defining the true Islam, as if by the United States defining the true Islam, which according to the government apparently doesn't have any content at all except that it's relentlessly peaceful. Other than that, it doesn't seem to say much of anything. But think about this for a moment. These are people who hate us and don't care what we think. They think that we are their obstacle to what their goal is, which is the implementation of Sharia law, which in Islam, in this interpretation of Islam, and in a lot of interpretations of Islam, is the necessary precondition to Islamizing a society, which is what they understand their divine mission to be, right? That's what they believe. They think we're the enemy. They think we're the obstacle to that. Why on earth would we think that they define themselves based on what we say about them or what we think of them? Let me ask you all a question. There's another sheikh, a guy by the name of Sheikh Yusuf Karadi. He's the most important Muslim Brotherhood, Sharia, they call them clerics. I prefer jurists because Sharia is a code of law, and that's really what his expertise is. It's legal. So anyway, Sheikh Karadi is the most influential Islamic jurist probably in the world. He started an outfit called Islam Online that gets millions of hits. He has a program called Sharia Enclaves that gets broadcast in the Middle East. It's watched by millions of people. He's on all these big influential boards, the fatwa board of this and the fiqh board of that. So anyway, this guy's a very, very important guy in Islam. And he's got a lot to say about Christianity. He's got a lot to say about Judaism. He's got a lot to say about every belief system that we have in the West. Now that I've told you that, and I've told you that there's this guy who actually influences probably hundreds of millions of people, think about your own lives. Is there anything in your life that you would or would not do based on what Sheikh Karadi is going to say about it, or what he thinks of it? How many people in this room knew who Sheikh Karadi was before I just described him to you? Right? Okay. Now, understanding how crazy that is, that's American national security since 1993. Our theory is they care what we think, and they care what we say. And as a result, if we call terrorism, workplace violence, and we say that the military operations we're involved in are overseas contingency operations, and we try to soften the way we talk about it, that it's going to change, and people who don't care about us except to hate us are going to change their behavior. The cornerstone of our national security policy since 1993 has been that we can define an Islam of our very own, that it will become somehow the standard authoritative Islam in the world, and by doing that, it will have the effect of marginalizing our enemies, and they'll no longer be influential. In the meantime, the body counts continue to grow, the attacks continue to happen, and they couldn't possibly make it more clear to us that they don't care a bit what we say about them or what we think about them. And what we say and what we think has nothing to do with recruitment. You notice that everything that's conservative, it seems, causes recruitment for terrorism. I used to wonder, there's a lot of well-meaning people in the government who want to believe that we have to soften our rhetoric, because if we link Islam to terrorism, even if it's true, that way we convince all of Muslims that we're at war with all of Islam, and we can't afford that, so we have to very psychologically try to temper our language. Now, for the reasons I just described to you, I think that that's cockamamie, but at the same time, I don't doubt their good faith. There are people who actually believe that, okay? But then there is another strain of thought in the government which is kind of cynical, and there's a lot of people who practice it too. And one of the reasons they don't want you to look at ideology, and they don't want you to understand the enemy that we're up against, is they know that if ideology, if a doctrine drawn from Islam doesn't cause terrorism, well, something's got to be causing it, right? So what's the something? Well, you get to fill in the blank. 1 week it's Israel, 1 week it's Guantanamo Bay, 1 week it's George Bush, 1 week, did I mention Israel? 1 week it's Donald Trump. But just think about what the tactic is. The fill in the blank causes it is a very powerful rhetorical tool. It's a very powerful demagogic tool. The thing that you're against happens to be what causes mass murder attacks. So, we've got a lot of people who can do a lot of nasal gazing over terrorism, and we've got a lot of people, particularly in Washington, who've learned to use terrorism and what causes it as a powerful demagogic tool, But we haven't gotten very good at the one thing that ought to be important, which is figuring out what it is we're up against and divining a national security strategy that works in light of it. And what I would say about that is a few things. First, understanding the way the threat came to us, it came to us in the form of terrorist attacks, right? Which frightened us and became more audacious over time and killed more people over time. So given the way that it presented itself to us, it's entirely reasonable that our first impression was the jihadists are what it's all about. You know, the mass murderers. Because of the immediacy and the horrific nature of it, obviously the terrorists had to be our first focus. But I think that went on for such a long time that we have completely misunderstood the depth of the threat. And what that has allowed is a lot of people who pretend to be moderates but are anything but to slipstream in behind the terrorists as, you know, people who are moderate, people who we can deal with, people we can ally with. And I would argue to you that the line that we have to draw between who's a moderate and who's a pro-Western American Muslim who we want in our community and in our country is not terrorism. It's this fundamentalist understanding of Islamic law. And I would just put it this way. If you want to supplant the United States Constitution with a system that is systematically discriminatory against women, discriminatory against non-Muslims, discriminatory against homosexuals, a system that denies the fundamental foundation of our government, which is that we, the people, have a right to chart our own course, to make our own law, irrespective of any other code like Sharia. If you think that this totalitarian code, which really does want to control everything from the great things to the small things, from military, economic, and political affairs, all the way down to interpersonal relations and hygiene. If you think that that authoritarian code should supplant the United States Constitution, the framework of liberty, then you're not a moderate. I mean, we might be very grateful that you're not going to blow up a bridge to try to bring it about, but that's not a moderate attitude. And until we understand that, and until we fix the right line separating our friends from the people who want to overthrow our system, we are never going to get this right. We are always going to be under a threat because we're never going to understand the threat that we're up against. There's basically two units of the threat as it presents. One is the jihadists, and today they are a more profound threat than they were even right before 9/11, because now you not only have Al-Qaeda, which is resurgent and is as much of a threat as it ever was, you also have ISIS, which is just a breakaway faction of Al-Qaeda. It actually started as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it now controls a spate of territory, a swath of territory in what used to be recognizable as Syria and Iraq, that as of 2014, this goes back and forth because of the war that's ongoing now, but in 2014, they covered more of a landmass than Great Britain, with 9 million people under their rule and millions of people who are displaced. So you have this jihadist aspect of the threat, and obviously that's the immediate threat. But the other thing that we have to focus on is the Muslim Brotherhood and the like-minded stealth jihad. One of the famous things that Sheikh Karadi, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, says is, "We will conquer America, we will conquer Europe, but not by the sword, by dawah." And when he says dawah, what dawah is Islam's, and this is this Muslim Brotherhood sort of Sharia supremacist Islam. It's their very aggressive form of proselytism, of going out and conquering by basically turning enclaves into Islamic areas and trying to widen and knit them together. And the strategy that they are following is something that's been described as voluntary apartheid. The idea is you encourage Muslims to move from these war-torn Middle Eastern areas into Europe and the West. And what they're told to do is integrate, but don't assimilate. Cling to Sharia. You know, cling to your guns and your religion. That sound familiar? But the idea is that you set up these enclaves. They have them all over and all around Paris, for example. You know, sometimes they're called no-go zones. They're, you know, there's degrees of difference from one to the next. But what they do is they basically plant their flag and they say, the law here is going to be Sharia. And when the numbers get to a certain critical mass, they're able to put more and more pressure on the home government to allow themselves to govern under their own affairs. And if it goes on long enough and the numbers get good enough, then they challenge the right of agents of the state, including police, firemen, ambulances, and the like, to actually even come into the enclave, because that's an act of sovereignty. And the whole idea here is to deny sovereignty. So the idea is to establish these enclaves, spread them out, and without necessarily firing a shot, you've taken over lots of territory. Except it's never without necessarily firing a shot. And this is the last thing I'd like to say before we start with questions. We need to understand that even though the jihadists have a lot of nasty things at times to say about the Muslim Brotherhood guys, and the Muslim Brotherhood guys are very shrewd about using the jihadists to portray themselves as moderate, because they, I mean, if ISIS is your standard, I guess they're moderates, right? But don't be fooled, because they all want the same thing, which is to establish Sharia as a precondition for Islamizing the West. And as much as they point fingers at each other as they do, a lot of that is theater for our benefit, because the stealth jihad works because of the atmosphere of intimidation that's created by the jihadists. And the jihadists, in turn, are able to be a bigger threat domestically because of the success of the Sharia encroachment of the stealth jihad. So what do you have in Europe now as a result of this dynamic? You have these enclaves throughout Europe, and you have Europe under siege at the moment. Why does that happen? It happens for the same reasons that the blind Sheikh encouraged the same kind of arrangement in New York 25 years ago. If you cede authority, if you allow the establishment of these enclaves, what they become is hotbeds of the jihad. It's the places where radicalization goes on, where recruitment goes on, where fundraising goes on, where the mosque and the Islamic Community Center become, as the Muslim Brotherhood's founder Hassan al-Banna called them, the axis of the movement, wherever the movement exists. So the jihad is basically leveraged by the dawah guys. The dawah is successful because of the jihadists, and as much as they try to play act that they're in sort of opponents of each other from time to time, they're actually unified in a very strong way against a common enemy, and that's us. And that hasn't changed in 25 years. It's not going to change because of the way we talked about them. It's not going to be changed because of the actions or the language that we use. The only thing that changes course here is if we have resolve to do the things that are simple but hard to implement. The only way this gets defeated is the jihadists have to be challenged anywhere on earth without geographical limitation where they operate. They have to be treated as a military enemy. That's number one. Number two, state sponsors of terrorism have to be treated as hostiles. We can't align anymore with people who smile at our face and are feeding the jihad behind our backs. Right? That doesn't mean That doesn't mean that we have to invade every country. But what it does mean is we have to recognize an enemy for an enemy. You treat it as a hostile, and you use every lever of government to squeeze them until they either stop terrorism or we have regime change. That's pretty much what President Bush, in an unvarnished way, said about 7 days after the 9/11 attacks. I'd add one addendum to it, and that is we have to confront the ideological jihad or the ideological Sharia supremacism, and that's recognizing the Muslim Brotherhood and their role in all of this. They're not necessarily a military enemy, although Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood in Israel and the Palestinian territories, right? But the Muslim Brotherhood, while the jihadists are doing their thing, are a very sophisticated, ground-up revolutionary movement. And their idea is to bore inside our institutions and wage the battle in the media, on the campus, and in every institution of opinion. They need to be confronted. Because if you look at what they believe, they shouldn't be able to defend it in the West. Their beliefs are horrible. The system they want to impose is horrible. But the reason we're allowing them to defeat us is we demagogue everybody who tries to shine the light of exposure on them. So the way to defeat them is no more political correctness, expose it. We don't want to be France, right? We don't want to be France for a lot of reasons, but we don't want to do things like ban the burqa or do things that challenge our principles. But the best principle that we have for waging this war is the First Amendment, exposure. Right? Daylight, sunlight. Show what they believe and make them defend it in the public square. They won't be able to do it. Well, anyway, thank you very much for having me. And I'm happy to do questions.
Since President Obama has established that the precedent that the USA will pay ransom for state-held hostages, do you think he will take the next step and negotiate with the exchange of captured or convicted terrorists in the next batch of hostages? Or what happens after what happened this last week?
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but President Obama has been doing this since 2009, and it already has involved the bartering of jihadist captives for other concessions and releases and so on. He did it in connection with the Iranians, with the jihadist networks that they were running in Iraq, including one that in which 5 American soldiers were killed. A number of those people were released to the Iraqi government. He did it famously or infamously in connection with the Taliban commanders who were released in exchange for Bo Bergdahl. And now he's done it in this different way of this absolutely not ransom $400 million in foreign currency shipped to Iran in the dark of night in an unmarked cargo plane that got there just before our hostages were released. I would just say in general, the next 6 months, some atrocious things are going to happen. I read today, right before I came over here, that while all of the hullabaloo over the election is going on, 34 additional prisoners at Guantanamo Bay were apparently in the last couple of days cleared to be released. So since Congress won't give him legislation that closes Guantanamo Bay, he is releasing jihadists, even though the jihad is actually stepping up in terms of its targeting of Americans and the battle being waged on even the traditional battlefield. So I think we're in for more of the same.
Okay, so I've got my team here trying to go through duplicates. This one was kind of interesting as well. The parents of Huma Abedin, who's known here as Hillary's second daughter, which I think is kind of cute, was brought to and went by the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. I think her brother is a luminary in that. How influenced do you think she is?
Well, she's obviously influential in her agency, but let's not, one of the things that we often do wrong is overstate the case, right? So let's just try to stick with what we know. It's not, I think, so much that she influences Hillary Clinton. It's Hillary Clinton hired her because of who she is and because of what her background is. And if her agenda is in part being sympathetic to Islamists, and I think there's a lot of good reason to think that, with respect to Mrs. Clinton, she's pushing on an open door. So yeah, I'd be more concerned than about Ms. Abedin in particular. I would be concerned about the trajectory of Mrs. Clinton's policies while she was at State, and Ms. Abedin and a number of other people who were of that bent of mind were her top advisors. Because as we saw during that whole term, American policy shifted very radically, radical is the right word in many contexts in this case, from formal opposition to the Muslim Brotherhood to embracing the Muslim Brotherhood and trying to have an open dialogue with Islamists. They believe, and this is a key difference, I think, between the national security right and the people currently governing the country. They believe there are moderate Islamists and that we can make common cause with them. And I'm here to tell you, if you're an Islamist, that means you want Sharia. That means you're not a moderate. So.
Right there. This is, yes, thank you. Well, that was a perfect segue, Andy. How would you respond to a Muslim who says ISIS isn't Muslim?
The same thing I'd say to an American who says ISIS isn't Muslim, or a non-Muslim who says ISIS isn't Muslim. Sometimes you fall back on the things you know the best. So I was raised as a Catholic, and it's important to make this point because it gives us a little insight into what's happening, what the dynamic is in Islam. In Catholicism, whether you agree with the Pope or disagree with the Pope, Catholicism has a hierarchical order, and the Pope has authority to declare what is and is not proper doctrine. And in that kind of a structure, I'm not making a comment on the substance of what he says, I'm just talking about the structure. In that kind of a structure, it's very easy to marginalize heresy as heresy. You can say that set of beliefs is not what our doctrine is. And because the Pope has that authority, the heretics become marginalized. In Islam, they don't have anything like that. And I've maintained for a number of years that there is no one true Islam. There's a variety of Islam as it's practiced and understood across the world. And for my money, we have wasted 25 years trying to grapple with what is the true Islam when it doesn't matter in terms of the only thing we should care about, which is American national security. There is a certain percentage of the Islamic world, and I would suggest it's probably in the hundreds of millions, who believe this literalist, fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. What difference does it make to us whether they're right or not?
Yeah.
What difference does it make to us whether it's true or not? The only thing we know is they believe it, right, and we have to defend the country, right? So I think it's a waste of time to worry about what the true Islam is.
We've had a couple of questions and comments about CARE, C-A-A-R.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Yeah, this is sort of astounding here. Apparently, the California Assembly, that's not your problem, fortunately for you, in conjunction with CARE, just declared August as Muslim Appreciation Month in California. I don't know if that's true. But would you comment on CARE and their influence inside of California and out?
I think they should have gone with February. It's a shorter month. Look, CARE was born out of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it was born out of a very specific problem that occurred in the early to mid 1990s, which was when President Clinton basically made his bet on Arafat, and Arafat's big rival was Hamas for control of what became very lucrative Palestinian Authority. It became dangerous in the United States to be a Hamas supporter, which it hadn't been like 5 minutes before, because we started to enact laws that barred material support to terrorism. So you could actually be convicted of a felony for supporting Hamas, which was what the Muslim Brotherhood's main job in America has been since the late 1980s, is the support of Hamas. Most of what we talked about tonight was how we don't want to understand their ideology. The thing is, we may not want to understand them, but they go to school on us. And what they understood was that if you want to be successful in America, you need to have a publicist who has a grasp of the law, who has media savvy, and for good measure, and this was brilliant on CARE's part, can sell itself as a civil rights or human rights organization. Because people are happy to then quote you and give you legitimacy without going underneath it and seeing what you're really up to. So they have, I think, brilliantly, up until the Holy Land Foundation trial in the 2007-2008, which really kind of blew a lid off what the Muslim Brotherhood was doing in America, CARE had a great thing going for over a decade. And unfortunately, with the Obama administration, they're back to being very influential again, even though they're a little bit more quiet about it than they were before.
Okay. And here's a practical question, somewhat related to your comment there. How do we best interact with Muslims in our work, schools, neighborhood, Facebook, and to separate the radicals from the moderate, as few as there are, and could, with this whole tension between what really is a moderate, what's the best way in our daily lives perhaps to interact?
Well, I think that you don't want to my mind, you don't want to single out people, because there's all kinds of people you could single out for a variety of reasons. And let's not, look, no one's been, I think, more of a hard ass about this than I have in a lot of ways. But let's also get a grip on where we are versus where Europe is, right? Why do we have so much less significant, I'm not saying it's insignificant, but less significant a national security challenge than they have in, say, France? The difference really is the critical mass of the numbers. We're a vast country of 320 or so million people. The Muslim population in America is still only about 1%, about 3 million people. There may be more Muslims in the country than that, but that's about the reliable number, or as reliable as we can get. Now, the number, by the way, is spiking because President Obama has stepped up the pace. But still, we're talking about 1% of the population. In France, Islam is somewhere between 7 and 11% of the population. And astonishingly, when they poll people in Paris and they ask them, how big do you think the Muslim population of France is, they answer like 35%, 40%. They think it's even bigger than it is. And when you have a critical mass of numbers is when you start to lose your grip on things. We don't have that yet, and I don't think we want to be these European countries. The difference between us and them, and the difference that we have to preserve, is that we have not ceded sovereignty over enclaves of our country to people who want to run their lives under Sharia. And as long as we continue that, we will be able to maintain something of the security situation, even though we have to be a lot more vigilant about ideology than we are to try to smoke out the jihadists. But we're not France yet, and I don't think we ought to panic as if we were.
So, one of our guests wants to know, are you planning a sequel to the Grand Jihad or working on a sequel or some other book?
I guess it depends on what they blow up. I think, I've been thinking about this a lot. I think the idea of American national security creating an Islam of its very own has been so harmful to us that that might be worth treatment, but I'm still rolling it around.
All right.
And there's plenty of room to roll. So.
Yeah, there are. Could you speak to how could we prevent the recruiting of Muslims or jihadists in our prisons? Understand that's a problem.
It's a huge problem, and I don't really. The reason the enclave strategy works is because once an enclave is in the grip of Sharia, the people in it become kind of like a captive audience, and that's the problem that you have in the prisons. They have to turn to gangs in order to survive, and they obviously don't have the liberty to get up and leave, so it's a much more challenging environment and a much more favorable environment for radicalization. So I don't really know that there's much we can do about that except do a better job of policing what goes on in the prison, but that's a lot easier said than done.
The next questioner is, I have read that there are members of the Muslim Brotherhood that are active in our government and the White House. Can you comment?
Yeah.
You can pass.
No. The Muslim Brotherhood is very influential in the in policy councils in our government, to the point that its network persuaded the incumbent administration to purge training materials that are used by our law enforcement, military, and intelligence personnel to understand the threat. And I don't want to single out the Obama administration, because the Bush administration was unfortunately very lax in this regard as well. And they were looking for love in all the wrong places, just like these guys are. Except, this is a transformative administration, and I kind of sometimes know that they know the bad guys are the bad guys, but they think they can work with them. I think the Bush administration largely got snookered by this and largely was too anxious to do Islamic outreach, and unfortunately the lazy man's way of doing outreach is to go to the actual organizations, and the organizations, many of them are tentacles of the Muslim Brotherhood, so you end up with the wrong people.
Here's a thought-provoking one. Part of the problem we have dealing with Islam is our constitutional right for the freedom of religion, but at what point is there any effect that can be made when you define, is Islam a legal system or a religion?
Well, I think this goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about, which is why I think the focus needs to be on Sharia. Sharia is a legal system. I mean, the problem with regarding Islam as a traditional religion is that it's not one as we understand it in the West, in the sense that there is a mainstream interpretation of Islam that does not recognize a separation between what we see as separation between church and state, I guess mosque and state, but they don't see the political realm as separate from civic society and social and personal matters. Now, there are many, many Muslims in the West who are here because they embrace Western liberty. And if those people see the religious elements of Islam, and Islam does have religious elements, the oneness of Allah, the duty to pray 5 times a day, and the like, if they see those spiritual elements as simply that, and they think that Sharia law, whatever it means in the sense of being a personal compass for them, is not something that ought to be imposed on society, then those Muslims we should have no problem with those Muslims in the West, and we don't have those problems. Remember, as I said at the beginning, we had Muslims who infiltrated terror cells. We couldn't have done it without them. They fight in our military. They're in our intelligence. We need these people, and we don't want to drive them away by being gratuitously nasty. But at the same time, we have to defend the country, and I think, if you want to impose Sharia, if you want a Sharia government in the United States, that's not a place from which we can have alliances.
Right. Here's a real easy one. How can the U.S. counter Saudi secret funding of terrorists worldwide?
They could treat them like a hostile regime instead of an ally.
Yes. Short and sweet, yeah.
You know, I know that you know, a lot of our relationship with the Saudis is based on the help that they give us for intelligence purposes and defense purposes. A lot of that is obviously, most of it is because of Saudi self-interest, but you know, a large part of the reason they have such a good intelligence product to share is they're in cahoots with the bad guys, or at least they have, you know, elements of the regime that are. Look, I think every country has to be put to a choice, and if you're going to facilitate terrorism, and we know you do that, we have to treat you as hostile until you stop. And I know you want to get through more, but this is important. Remember how ISIS put itself on the map about a year and a half, 2 years ago? They beheaded 3 Western journalists, and everybody got all up in arms, and rightly so, because of the horrific nature of it. The same month, the Saudi government beheaded 8 people for violations of Sharia, which is basically the law of Saudi Arabia. So, you know, this isn't ISIS ideology or theology.
Yeah, all right.
It is what it is.
Could you share your thoughts of Obama's efforts to close Gitmo?
Look, Obama succeeded in a lot of his counterterrorism at the beginning of his administration by coasting on the intelligence product that was developed by the Bush-Cheney counterterrorism methods that he so condemned. And I am not here to make a case for waterboarding, but I am here to make a case for interrogation. And this is one of the places where it's really important to understand that terrorism is really not a criminal justice problem. You can't Mirandize the enemy and get battlefield intelligence. You cannot judicialize warfare, because especially in a war like the one we're in, which is not against a traditional enemy, but an enemy that attacks us in stealth, intelligence takes on a premium in this war that it hasn't had. Intelligence is important in every war, but in this one it's unusually important because it's all we have. And the best intelligence you can get, you know, you can hope to get a bug or a wiretap in a right place. It's very hard to do because you have to get somebody who's got access to it to help you. You can hope to flip somebody. It takes years to like try to get them to infiltrate an organization. We got very lucky in the blind Sheikh case with the guy that we had. But you know, to get into the inner sanctum with an operative is very, very hard. The best intelligence that we get are people that we capture in the act of either plotting or carrying out terrorism. Yeah. Because they're the people who have fresh intelligence, if there is any to be had, about what other people are doing. And the point of Guantanamo was to have a place where that could go on, and to treat people not as they were criminal defendants, but as they were basically war prisoners. I don't want to say prisoners of war, because that's a whole term of art in the Geneva Conventions. You need to be able to interrogate. And again, I'm not talking about interrogation methods now. I'm talking about the principle that the best intelligence you get are for people who are active operatives who you capture. And if you don't have a place to put them where you can question them without lawyers being involved for days or weeks or months or however long, even if it's got to be done under the supervision of a court, it has to be done. And if you don't have a place for it, and you kill when you can capture because you've so screwed up the law of capture that it's now, how human rightsy is this, right? They kill now when they could capture someone because it's cleaner for them, right? But that's what drives up our intelligence product. If we don't have the kind of intelligence product we had around 2008, we're not going to be able to protect this country.
Here's a little bit of a sideline. Is Islam cooperating with the drug cartels in exchange for smuggling Muslims into the U.S.? The drug angle.
You know, Hezbollah's been working with drug cartels for decades, as long as there's been Hezbollah. The whole idea of jihadist terrorism is that you can carry out atrocities that would ordinarily, in their rationale, be against the laws of God and man because you're serving the greater good of the jihad. If that's your mindset, you can rationalize anything. So it doesn't matter that, for example, Muslims in principle would be against narcotics trafficking. If they can rationalize that by participating in the narcotics trafficking, they're feeding the jihad, then they'll participate in the narcotics trafficking. The blind sheikh, we proved in the trial, gave speeches which stood for the proposition that they could do bank robberies for purposes of jihad. Now, bank robbery is something that ordinarily in an Islamic society would be punished brutally. I mean, they have different kinds of money systems, but the point is theft in general gets punished very severely under Sharia. But they taught that as long as you were contributing a goodly portion of the proceeds to the furtherance of the jihad, bank robbery was peachy. And so is narcotics trafficking, and so is anything else they think will further the cause.
Would you like to, for any reason, speak to about Khizr Khan at the DNC? Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it was. I don't want to make too much of a commentary on Donald Trump's campaign. I have not been a Trump person, although, as I've said, I'm never Hillary. So, be that as it may. But I think Trump has a disturbing proclivity to step on the story when the Democrats are imploding. So, for example, because of this dopey Second Amendment line that he threw out today, instead of the news tonight being that Hillary Clinton gave a speech last night where she had behind her the father of the jihadist in Orlando who killed dozens of people, the story tonight on the news is going to be, was Trump suggesting that Hillary should be assassinated, which is, I mean, look, the media will twist what he says anyway, even if he doesn't make any mistakes. So giving them material doesn't seem to me to be very sensible. And with respect to Mr. Khan, that was a 7-minute speech, which even if the media had played it up, it would have been a 2 or 3 day story, and that would have been the end of it. It's a Gold Star family. They lost a son fighting for the United States. You can't win that. I mean, I don't care if Mr. Khan is the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, you can't win that. So I think it would have been the better part of valor to just let it be. And I think what I pray for the Trump campaign is what they call in television 7-second tape delay, right? There's got to be something that tells him, like, when it's here, it doesn't have to come out here.
Yeah, filter, that sounds good. And maybe we'll close with something a little bit off topic, because like I was thinking when I was listening to you, Andy, I don't know how you sleep at night, because you know all this stuff and you think about it all the time, and I just think it's amazing you can be so pleasant in casual conversation. But anyhow, why do our other branches of government, judicial and legislative, of course, of government, continue to let Obama act unconstitutionally? Now you can put on your lawyer hat.
Well, I wrote a book about this called Faithless Execution. And I was attacked when the book came out by Republicans because they were afraid of anything that mentioned the I word. And my book was about impeachment, but it wasn't a call to impeach Obama. And I did have in there what an impeachment, what articles of impeachment would look like. But the point of the book was to explain that the framers thought that impeachment was, as Madison put it, an indispensable part of our framework of government. It was an essential element of the government they formed in order to prevent the thing that they were most worried about, which was that the new presidency would become a dictator. So the key things that Congress was given was the power of the purse and the impeachment power. And the problem in our government, which is now, I guess, after a century, and particularly the last half century of progressive policies, is the power of the purse is not much of a weapon anymore. Because if every time you stop government payments or threaten to shut down the government in order to use the power of the purse to rein the executive branch in, if it means that this group isn't getting their entitlements and that group isn't getting their entitlements, politicians are going to go, no way, I'm never going to use that. So what Republicans did was say, well, look, we are never going to shut down the government no matter what you do. And then they said, and we're also never going to impeach you no matter what you do. Because I believe they've taken all the wrong lessons from the Clinton impeachment. And that's a long conversation that we don't have time to get into. But my point is, if you have a rogue president, and even by his own account, Obama is a rogue president. I mean, he unilaterally amended the Obamacare statute, which is his own law. I didn't check this morning how many times it's been, but it's like, in the dozens of times that he's basically refused to enforce the law, which is the president's main job, by the way. And on the immigration, he said time and time and time again, and this happened to be true. He doesn't say things that are true all the time, but this was important. He didn't have the authority to do what he did. He couldn't unilaterally decree these forms of amnesty, and then he hauled off and did it. So by his own account, he doesn't do what his main constitutional job is, right? So if you know you have a lawless president, and you basically tell him no power of the purse and no impeachment, that's a political calculation that you can make. You can say, look, we'll be hurt more politically if we do these things than if we refrain from doing them. But understand that in this system, that has a price. And the price is that it's a green light to a rogue president to do anything he thinks politically he can get away with. So, what do they say? You either got to put on your big boy pants and, We here in the peanut gallery, we can rant and rave. But if you're in Congress, you have an obligation that's part of the job to rein in a rogue executive. And we've lost that. We've lost the notion. It's not just a political option that they have. Like, could we get more hurt than help by this? This is actually part of their job. And if they don't do it, nobody can. And to my mind, if you have the power to stop him, and you don't, then where I come from, you're an aider and abetter. Now, you may be a reluctant one, but, either do your job or get out of the way and let somebody else do it. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. That was wonderful.
Thank you.